I have to start with Shamila. Shamila runs NBI, 100 companies in South Africa working together on sustainable development. Originally, I think, set up by Nelson Mandela.
That's great.
You have to leave in 4 minutes. So, regulation or voluntary approach, what are the trends in South Africa, and how would South African business leaders respond to the call of Sir Chris?
The reality on the ground in South Africa is that a transition on the scale and the urgency that we need to have is a daunting task, and particularly for companies in carbon-intensive industries or those in economies that are highly reliant on those sectors. As you can imagine, the human element, largely characterized by fear and uncertainty, brings in a different element into the debate in which one needs to consider. And so that is where, when we talk about a just transition and the justice element, becomes a very important part of that discussion. There's absolutely no doubt that the need for the transition is pressing, and the scale and pace at which we need to move, I think, is no longer a question. We don't have time, and we understand that. But taking people along is going to be critical, because without that, there is going to be no transition. And we're seeing that already. If you look at a context in South Africa characterized by massive unemployment, huge inequality, how do you solve for these challenges and add to that the uncertainty that comes with it? Now, part of that answer is really talking about the need for accountability and transparency. Companies are embedded within communities, and so the conversation that they have is a huge part and parcel of what needs to happen. They need to build trust, and to build trust, you have to have open and honest conversations. But that trust also needs to be characterized by transparent information sharing, and it is in that process that we can hope to go faster in making sure that we're deliberate about that. The trends in South Africa are certainly showing that we are seeing different elements develop, and key you can see is a lot of fear, for example, and uncertainty in those industries embedded in the fossil fuel sector. And what does that mean for workers that are likely going to be stranded, and also that a transition really is a like-for-like replacement on jobs in a certain area. And so what does that mean for people? So that is something we need to consider. And there is a need to take the whole of industry along. So if I look at the collective work that we've done in South Africa under the National Business Initiative, was really saying we can't wait. How do we get together and understand what it's going to take to achieve net zero by 2050, and then collectively with industry developed a set of pathways, which were called our Just Transition Pathways work. What that did was also help give the government political cover to go to COP26 with enhanced ambition on the NDCs, and gave companies sectoral blueprints on what decarbonization could look like for them, very detailed modeling using the energy utilities modeling basis. We've seen voluntary action take place now, with a number of companies actually using those as blueprints to start informing their net zero strategies ahead of regulation or anything else. So those are positive trends, but there's a clear social dimension that needs to be adequately considered and planned for if we expect there to be any justice with the transition, Peter.
Great. Thanks so much, Shamila. I don't want to scare you off the stage, but your time has come. So thanks so much for being here.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Sherry, let me go to you. What is it, 3 weeks into the new role? 3 months?
It's 9 weeks. I'm
9
counting
weeks.
in
Wow,
weeks.
okay,
So.
then you're in the position to answer. New CEO of CDP, 23,000 companies representing about 2/3 of the global market capitalization provide data into your systems. So what kind of trends are you seeing when it comes to climate data?
Thank you, Peter, and thanks very much for having us here today. I think that when we talk about data in this whole ecosystem, it was important when CDP was founded 20 years ago. I feel like it's even more important today, because when we're looking at the global stock take, which everyone's speaking about, what is a stock take? A stock take is a measurement. It's an audit. It's a how are we doing? And of course, I think we all can agree it's grim reading. So how is it that actually we can take data and make it actionable and useful? And I think that that's the biggest shift that we're seeing, is that we have a huge amount. We are the world's largest not-for-profit disclosure mechanism and nudging new information into being. But so what? Actually, what really matters is for that data to be used. And what we're seeing is 3 really actionable use cases coming to the fore. One of them is compliance, and I think we heard from Chris earlier about how important regulation is in all sectors. And so it's not just financial compliance, and we're seeing lots with the ISSB, et cetera, trying to put some disclosure frameworks, but it's also within all the industry verticals. That compliance carrot or stick, depending on how you see it, is a big use case for data, but it's not the only one. That same question that we ask about data can also be used for access to capital. Being able, again, to service that investment community, to direct capital in the right direction. It also, and we're seeing this increasingly, being used for internal purposes or trying to manage the supply chain. So big suppliers out there are asking their supply chain to disclose so that they can roll that up and understand what actions they can take, what pressure they can put on it. And actually, that's a big shift in terms of mentality. It's not just disclosure for disclosure's sake or for compliance or box ticking. It's about taking action with this data. And I think that's something we all need to think about, especially as we start thinking about the stock take, because the reality is, when you have a NDC, a nationally committed number, the reality is there's only a couple levers that a country can pull. One is their direct influence on their government activities, just like a corporate or any other entity out there. And the other is policy and regulation. And if they both are pulled strongly, then you can see how there is even more disclosure and action that comes from that. And we're seeing that through our data globally. But the reality is that those two levers are strong in certain countries and weak in others. So we need to look at it from a whole of economy perspective. So those non-state actors and their disclosures, their actions are going to be really influential. And one last point, Peter, if I may, if you're asking about where we're seeing shifts in what about data, it's about transition planning. So it's not only about auditing what happened before, but it's also about trying to take stock of what is going to happen and holding people to account, be that at the corporate level or be that at the country level. And for from a CDP perspective, really, if you have a transition plan, you need two things. One is a baseline. And that's a data-centric baseline. The second is you need a science-based target that has a time-bound nature to it. So if you have those two things, you're on your way to a transition plan. And some of the data that we should be collecting is, what actions are you taking? What did you say you're going to do? What is it that you have done? And making sure that that is an annual review, maybe even more frequently as we accelerate through. But let's walk before we run. I think those two pieces, Peter, are where we're seeing trends. We're use case driven, and we're starting to think a lot more about how that data supports transition plans.
And CDP has basically been built on voluntary commitments, voluntary disclosures. Sir Chris made quite a clear point that voluntary wasn't going to get us home. So what is your response to that?
We at CDP are absolutely in line with that thinking. We are very supportive of mandatory disclosures, but I don't think we should stop at that. I think we should have mandatory actions that are being monitored and measured. And again, that's where the data comes in and makes itself useful. If CDP didn't exist, there would be a lack of accountability in a global platform which is neutral to be able to compare and contrast what is happening out there. So I think that the mandatory disclosures and the mandatory regulations need to be paired with a way for us all to reliably account for how that progress is being made. So I think that the data piece may be retrospective in past years. Now we're pivoting to make sure that that is really fit for purpose today and tomorrow.
Great, thank you. Sir Chris, I know you're also under some time pressure on the panel here, but can I talk to you in two ways? You said you have two jobs. One is the investor, the other running this amazing foundation called SIF. But as an investor, one of the things that I think about a lot is that the majority of the mainstream capital markets are still using discounted cash flow as the main instrument to do valuation and capital allocations. And how is that going to ever handle climate or biodiversity or other non-financial risks? And when are we going to change the valuation model in the capital market?
Well, investors clearly don't believe there's going to be action on climate change, which is why heavy emitters keep polluting and companies don't make the action because and so it's not that the valuation models are wrong. It's just that the assumption is that companies will be given license to destroy the planet. And it's hard to argue against them at this point in time. And so but actually, the day of reckoning cannot be avoided. People can put their head in the sand and ignore it, but it will come. And so if shareholders were not stupid, which many of them are, they would be pushing companies and regulators, okay, for action. But part of the problem is 30% of the shares are owned by index funds who don't really care, don't do anything, they're passive, and the rest are just the same. So the lack of shareholder activism, okay, in fractional share ownership is a huge problem. And another huge problem is that all these private companies where there's no disclosure, no regulation, and they just hide from any decarbonization whatsoever.
But waiting for the day of reckoning, I mean, that's the last scenario we have. But if you now look at the physical risks in supply chains, in agricultural supply chains, why aren't we pricing those in more consistently?
I have to believe that there is a tremendous short-termism of investors, okay, as well as a lot of ignorance. And but for sure, investors are extremely short-term. They look 1 year, 2 years. Agriculture itself isn't a large quoted sector, yeah, and that's another factor. Of course, it causes inflation, but I think investors generally are completely underestimating the risk of climate change, and there's a combination of both ignorance and willful ignorance going on.
So, with your other hat, the co-founder and chair of SIF, and beyond the point you made so clearly that we should all be advocating for regulation, we have a unique room here with heads of foundations, CEOs of companies. What can we do together to really progress this agenda in a way that we turn into action?
Combine to create, go and ask for regulation. I look at sustainable aviation fuel, look at that as an issue, okay? The EU is the only place with a mandate, but there's no penalties for the mandate, so it's a meaningless mandate for sustainable aviation fuel. And the companies are worried. Yep. The CEO of Airbus told me he's very worried about this, and he feels, what can we do? But some companies do want to change. Delta Airlines, Air France, KLM, they've said, we want to move to sustainable aviation fuel. We want help in pushing for that regulation. And that's where philanthropy can join these and try to create a coalition of leaders. You won't get every company, but philanthropy and business needs to work together to ask for regulation.
Great. Sir Chris, thanks so much. Let me turn over to Bob. Bob is the global chairman of PwC. You work with, all the large companies in the world. You have direct access to boardrooms. Somehow the world has a lot of belief that, COP28 is a starting point. In COP30 in Brazil, we're all going to do magic things. What do you see happen between now and then when it comes to climate accountability?
So let me pick up on a couple of things that were said previously. People generally ask the question, is the business community lessening the focus on climate? And my reaction is as follows. For those that have been focusing, the answer is no. The problem is, and this is where Chris goes, there's too many that aren't. And the reality is, we just did a survey of finance organizations, and unfortunately there's a saddened statistic in terms of the number of finance executives that have not taken a plan forward and have no intention to take a plan forward. So you have that phenomenon. The second phenomenon you have is that when you looked at the equity analysts, the credit agencies and the like, about 2.5 years ago, you had a tremendous pressure point building where the first 3 questions, always one of them had to be climate related. And then the pendulum swung back the other way, and it wasn't until question 25 that it came up. And no matter what the answer was, there was no implications, which is where Chris went. And there was no implications because no one did anything with it. And now to Sherry's point, what were the baselines and the data to say what impact does it really have on the company itself? Now let's pick up another piece that you asked Chris about, which is as you think about discounted cash flows, the reality is as you think about a model today and look at it over the longer term, you're not only going to deal with the physical risks that have a cost associated with it, you're going to deal with the loss of consumers if in fact consumers step up. And I say if they're willing to actually price differently and buy differently. And last but not least, you're going to have a higher recruiting cost if your employees are not seeing you do the things that are needed. And that stuff is not getting priced into your cash flow models today at all. And that's the realities. Now let's go to another reality to call it out. You have many organizations, including the ones that are here today, and including the ones where their CEOs are spending a lot of time on this topic, but the realities of the CFO and what they have to deal with are painting a different picture. If asked the question, where are your priorities? Many of them will say, well, I've got a series of revenue goals sitting over here, cost goals over here, and margin pressures that have actually increased quite a bit over the last 24 months because of the economy and the state of that economy. And up until 2 years ago, there were 2 buckets, my financial stuff over here and my climate and other sustainability stuff over here. And the reality is today, most companies, I'm going to call it 90+%, you still have those 2 buckets. If you asked a CFO to prioritize, they're still focused over here and not looking at it this way. Now, the ones that are good and the ones that are doing something, Chris, I don't want to be so counterintuitive here, but there are some that are thinking about this. They actually have blended together the financial and the sustainability things in an appropriate way. The problem is there's not enough of those companies out there doing that stuff. And that's the reality that's sitting here today. Now, let me pick up one more point that Chris lent to, and I endorse his comment on regulation. However, we actually got to digress that a little bit. Number one, standards. I use this acronym and story and narrative in Peter's council meeting the other day. You tell me something once, I might remember it. I'm not likely to do something about it. You tell me something 100 times consistently, I'm definitely going to remember it, and I might actually do something about it. You tell me something 100 different times, 100 different ways, I have no clue what you're talking about, and I need a PhD to tell me what it is. And in fact, it's going to cause paralyzation and no action whatsoever. And that's what we have today. And unfortunately, we haven't gotten a set of standards to get us there. And you're starting to see some emergence of that. The problem then goes to what do you do with the next step, which is truly regulation. And as Chris put up on his slide, you're starting to see some regulation come through. It's got to be smarter. It's got to be much more aligned. And the regulation comes in 2 ways. Number one is the reporting regulations, and let's remind ourselves why we have reporting regulations. It's to demonstrate the progress that Sherry talked about with the right data, that baseline compared to where you're going against that plan and then how you achieve that plan. And secondarily, you should be comparing one company versus another. And if you don't have that consistency, you're not able to do those things as an investor, a consumer, an employee, and the major stakeholders that are out there. And that's the challenge we have today. Let's go to the other side of regulation, if I can, on the non-financial side, though. We also need additional changes to regulation outside of the financial reporting and non-financial reporting area. Today, you've got too many old rules and regulations that are existing that are roadblocks. They're getting in the way of faster scaling up of plants or changes in infrastructure because we need more permits, different permits, and they take years to come forward. And that's the reality that's got to change too. And again, let's use an analogy we just went through with COVID. We changed the rules of the game on R&D with pharmaceuticals, development, testing, and sped everything up. Why? Because we had an immediacy of a crisis where people were dying. Let's not forget people are dying today because of climate. And that's a challenge. Third thing you need with regulation, to Chris's point, which he didn't talk about, is the attestation. Somebody's got to tell you it's truthful. We just did a survey. 94% of the same investors that Chris is talking about, himself and one of them, They don't believe what's out there. They think there's something materially wrong with it anyway. So where's the trust? And last but not least, you can't blanket regulation. It's got to be proportional. Otherwise, you kill the system. Multiple regulation is actually complex. It's costly. So the concept of materiality and importance and strategic importance is equally problematic. And that's the things we've got to be thinking about right now.
Subtle tick against the microphone.
Peter, could I just clarify one thing? When I talked
course.
about regulation, I was talking about emissions regulation. Of course, we need disclosure regulation and a plan disclosure, but the heart of the matter is emissions regulation.
Thanks so much. I have an impossible job. There's brilliant minds that could talk much longer. Sir Chris has to leave, Sherry has to leave, and my next keynote speaker has 5 more minutes before she has to leave. I'll come back after that, but let's give a big hand of applause to the panel.